almost like she knew she was being videoed.
She's like, I want to be on video.
Woo,
All right, let's go. Let's go on the ocean.
Huh?
No, let's go on the sand.
All right, come on, Lila. Didn't like that. Almost like she knew she was being.
Hello, Internet. Welcome to my new channel. This is the first live stream of my dedicated DevOps, Docker, Cloud, Kubernetes, and everything all in this channel. And we're starting from 0 subscribers. Thank you so much if you were here because you saw an email from me. And I wanted to kick things off right away because we got DockerCon happening next week in Barcelona. And I fly out tomorrow and we will spend the entire week talking to everyone we can at the conference. I'm going to be live streaming at least several times. It just kind of depends on the internet there and how much everyone else is using it. So I'll be definitely talking to other Docker captains. I have 2 Swarm workshops there, as well as a talk on taking Swarm into production and building out your stack. That's if you've seen some of my demos, that's my dog versus cat demo. I actually have a website on that. We could talk more about that later if you have any questions on this live chat. So the way it works here is you ask questions in the chat, and I talk about current events and topics for a few minutes, and then we sort of stack up the questions, and then I get to them, and hopefully I have some answers for you. Hopefully they're correct. I will maybe sometimes search things on the internet because I don't know the exact answer, but I'll try to give you links to things if that helps out. And hopefully bandwidth will behave, and this will be a great first YouTube live on this new channel. So thanks for subscribing. The way you get notified about every week when I go live on this channel is to click the subscribe and then the bell right next to the subscribe. If I was a super fancy YouTuber, I'd have like little pop-ups that say subscribe and click bell, and I don't have any of that yet. Maybe someday. So first, before we get to your questions, I want to talk about some stuff and specifically what's happened in the last couple of weeks. So obviously, if you're anywhere on the internet during the Black Friday event and now Cyber Monday event that we've had in the last decade or two on the internet. By the way, Black Friday has been around a long time, but Cyber Monday nowadays seems to be like the bigger deal, especially on the internet. It wasn't always that way. And in case you were curious, Cyber Monday came from the idea that back in the day, we all didn't have mobile phones and we didn't necessarily even have computers at home that had high-speed internet. So in the early 2000s, people would go to work on Monday and they would sit at work and shop because they had internet there. And so that's how Cyber Monday was born, is that all the internet companies realized that was when people had internet access, not when they were home on Thanksgiving, an American holiday, at the usually, the end of November. And by the way, there's actually, I learned recently, other countries that celebrate Thanksgiving as well in North America, but not on the same days. So we have like 2 or 3 Thanksgivings around the world. Really, it's just a bunch of eating and buying stuff on the internet. So that week, last week, I realized that there were some limitations with YouTube, and I've had a channel on YouTube for over a decade, and just recently started in the last couple of years talking Docker and DevOps, which I've been doing for quite some time now. And so because I had that old channel and some silliness with YouTube, there were certain things I couldn't do on that channel. So I had to create a new channel. So thanks for showing up here. The old one's still there. There's still videos there, and that stuff will stay there for at least some time until I can get it all moved over here. And new videos obviously will be coming. I think you've probably heard, if you've been here before, that I've got a new course coming, Docker for Node.js. And then if you have a question, yes, the Kubernetes course is coming. We've been working on that this autumn with a friend of mine, and we'll be announcing some of that stuff more after Docker for Node.js launches, which I hope to be in the month of December. That's my goal, but I don't try to make deadlines because they just drive everybody crazy. So we're going to get that high quality course on Node.js projects with Docker sometime soon. We've been recording for months now and planning for months now, so I am looking forward to you checking it out. In other news, we've got some things around Black Friday that I did want to mention. That after Black Friday, there's this event after Cyber Monday called Giving Tuesday. Now, Giving Tuesday is for donating or taking some of the money that you would have spent on Black Friday or other stuff, because we don't all necessarily need more stuff, and giving that to a charity of your choice. And I thought what I would do first is we could talk about a few of my favorites. And in fact, if you've bought one of my courses, chances are 3% of your purchase of my courses is going to one of these charities. They're usually internet related. So I thought I'd give them a shout out real quick. And let's do this over here real quick. So I just want to show you a quick couple of pages. So the first one up is Free Software Foundation, fsf.org. Check them out if you would like to donate to a nonprofit that's focused on keeping software truly free. And just because things are open source doesn't necessarily make them free. You might have noticed that nuance if you've been around in technology for a while, that just because it's open on the internet doesn't mean it's free. And it certainly doesn't mean that you get all of your digital rights with that free software. So the Free Software Foundation really focuses on education and encouraging people to make truly free software that doesn't have, spyware or adware, anything in it that would maybe track you or anything like that. So they really push hard for that kind of stuff and educate people on the internet. The next one that I love, it's one of my favorites, is EFF.org, and I've been a huge fan of them for decades now. The EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, is an organization focused around your digital rights online and basically keeping the internet open and free. You obviously have to pay usually for access to the internet, but the information on the internet tends to be free, and the traffic in there tends to be free and protected. The way that often happens is through proper government legislation, through lobbying. So EFS does a lot of campaigning and education, especially in the political world and just in the general internet, to make sure we understand our rights, that we keep the internet free and open. And they, by the way, are the maintainers of Certbot, which is the tool you use for Let's Encrypt. So they're obviously very much about online privacy as well. And if you've ever heard of Let's Encrypt, it's a free, I wouldn't say new anymore, but a relatively new SSL or TLS certificate generator for your websites. And we used to, up until a few years ago when Let's Encrypt was created, we used to all have to pay for every certificate for every website, and that meant that people just creating blogs and stuff wouldn't have SSL protection on their website, so that you would have some privacy about where you're going and what you're doing on the internet, and that you could also guarantee that the website was what you were seeing and that someone wasn't in the middle, man-in-the-middle attacks. So EFF does a lot with that, and they created Certbot, which is an automation tool to help you get Let's Encrypt certificates. And so they have that plus other free software. I actually use one of their browser plugins. That's one of my favorites. It's actually my preferred tracker, or basically ad disabler, if that's even a thing. Privacy Badger is one of their tools, and it's not focused on blocking every ad, but it's really focused on things that track you. And so it does more than just ads, and it also does less than maybe some ad blockers, because it does let some things through if they're not necessarily tracking you, right? So you can actually do ads without tracking, and some places do that. So they are focused purely on your privacy protection, and that's a free browser add-in for Chrome. I'm not sure if it's on the other browsers, but check out Privacy Badger. It's my preferred ad blocker. The other one, Wikipedia. So there's a company behind Wikipedia called Wikimedia, And they're a nonprofit, and mostly they're known for just launching Wikipedia. And every year they do this big campaign for Giving Tuesday to, well, and in the whole month of December to raise money. And it's really interesting, their statistics, because it's such a phenomena for all of us to use Wikipedia that even if we all just gave them, you know, the money of a coffee, if we just did that once a year, they would have more money than they could ever need. So they really don't have that big of an operating budget, but they do rely on donations. So every year for years now, I've given them a little bit of my change basically to make sure that they stay free and ad free, most importantly, because we just don't want ads on that kind of information. And I truly think that besides the internet, Wikipedia is one of the best human resources we have created in terms of the vault of knowledge that is, and that it didn't even exist, 20 years ago. So it's a really cool resource. Check them out. Give them a couple of your bucks if you have a few extra. And then the last one, in case you are specifically in America, is one that I've been involved with for years now, Code for America. They're basically focused on helping local governments, not necessarily federal, but local governments where you live, using modern technology through volunteer resources. So if you, sometimes we call them the code, the Peace Corps for geeks, if you've ever heard of the Peace Corps. And they allow you to volunteer your time in your city. There is a code for all for other countries, but Code for America is obviously the specific one just for America. So you might have a code for Ireland or code for Europe or something. Europe's not a country, but code for Ireland, I believe, is a thing, and maybe even code for Italy. I'm trying to remember. There's lots of other countries that have started their own basically on this concept. And the idea is that you donate your time. So even if you're not super, engineering guru, with just some tech background or an interest in helping out locally in your city, you can join these groups, volunteer online, physical meetups, as well as virtual meetups. And you basically are just helping the government where you can to use open technologies, modern internet technologies, and get their data basically to the citizens, because we're technically the ones that really own that stuff. Anyway, these are some of my favorite things. It is the time of year where we're all spending time with family and spending lots of money typically, so maybe save a few of your bucks for this stuff. But let's get to your questions. So a couple of things I wanted to mention is brettfisher.com/docker is where most of the things today will be. And a lot of times I'm mentioning the same resources, so I tend to put popular things that people ask about there and whatnot. So check that stuff out. All of my course coupons are there. Those coupons, by the way, are Black Friday pricing. So even if you missed Udemy's Black Friday stuff and you want to check out Swarm, my prices are right there on the page. They stay those prices. And my new courses, if you sign up for one of my courses or get on my newsletter, that's at brettfisher.com/newsletter. I'll put that link in there as well. You will get notified of anything new I post. So let's see, Brett Fisher. Newsletter. All right, so on to your questions. Thanks so much again for joining and listening to me ramble. So let's jump to your questions. But first, I'm going to change my studio so we have more real estate. This is my fancy little green screen. All right. Through the invention of modern technology, I am able to look like a Twitch stream, but I'm on YouTube. So let's check out some questions. And by the way, apologies if I don't get your name exactly correct. I'm bad at English. All right. Charles is first. Good morning, Charles. What is your best practices for deploying to multiple environments? So heavy hitter right off the bat. Multiple environments. So the key with any distributed application nowadays, and if you're not familiar with the 12-factor app, 12factor.net is a set of principles, and it's actually like a decade old now, but it's still relevant. It's a set of factors, things, or practices that you and your team can do with distributed applications. And one of those premises is to always use environment variables for setting up any potential environment settings. So if there's anything different between your local machine and dev and test and prod, any of those environments, you need to be using environment variables for those settings. Now, a lot of us are in different application programming frameworks, all have different types of files we're used to using for setting up, database connections and API keys and all that kind of stuff. So what you typically do with Docker is you're going to end up making some sort of entry point script or startup script in your Docker containers that takes the environment variables you set in Docker and then puts them into whatever file your app needs. So maybe if it's a JSON file for Node, or it's a PHP file for PHP, or a YAML file maybe. If you've got files like that that are configuration files with environment settings, you usually need to create your container images to take startup environment variables, whether that's in Kubernetes or Swarm or Docker Compose. All those things are going to be shooting environment variables into your container at startup, and then they will dynamically generate the startup script. In fact, if you look at MySQL or at Postgres as the official images, you will see that they have entry point scripts at Docker Hub, and those are great examples of startups. So startup scripts, rather. So if I go to MySQL on Docker Hub, and I click on a Docker file here, and you're seeing the Docker file there, but you don't realize that there's an entry point script behind it, and the entry point script will start and run and then pass sort of execution rights to the main program. So in this case, the MySQL D daemon will start up after the script has run. And you'll notice that if I just go up a directory inside the repo here, I see a Docker entry point script. And this entry point script does lots of things when MySQL starts. It actually creates the default database, it creates your user and sets the password. It does lots of stuff there. And it does a lot of that through environment variables that you set. And there's hundreds of lines of script here. And then at the very end of the script, it passes execution, that little exec down there, it passes execution back to the command, basically the parameters on the command, and that would be your CMD, right? So the CMD is in your Docker file, and that's usually starting up whatever the app is you want to run long term. So you can do this with any container image, and this is how on any project I will change the environment setup, and so that means I get one image for many environments, and it dynamically creates that. So that's the biggest thing on best practices, to make sure especially if you got existing apps and you need to move them into containers, that you do all this environment setup as a part of your initial image creation process. So other than that, proper continuous integration, proper continuous deployments, whether you're using Jenkins or Azure or Amazon, whatever your tool is for automation, you're going to want to have all your images automatically built by some system and then stored in a registry. You don't want to be doing that manually yourself. You want, when you do GitHub or whatever your GitLab or whatever your Git of choice is, whenever you're doing your code commits, then you have your images auto-built and stored in a registry. And then you just decide whether or not you want to automatically deploy images to Docker servers, or you want a manual sort of kickoff script every time you want to launch something in production. It's up to you how much you want to do that. Hopefully that helps get you started. That's just a few of the many best practices. Jose, good morning. Victor, how you doing? All right, Charles is back. Oh, I didn't see your second one there. Sorry, Charles. For example, we have apps that implement single sign that are deployed in 2 different Azure plans along with development environments. Each config and Apache config are different. Yes. So you're either going to set those through environment variables, or if you're using an orchestrator like Swarm or Kubernetes, they have something called config, or in Kubernetes it's called config maps, in Swarm it's called configs. Those are designed to store config files and then map them dynamically to your container at runtime. The key there is they're not stored in the image, because if there's specific settings in there that are specific per environment, you don't want them in the image. So that's what configs and config maps are for. That's what an orchestrator does for you. If you don't have one of those and you're just using pure Docker, you then have to kind of do that yourself. You have to create bind mounts and map scripts the hard way, or map configs the hard way. So hopefully that'll help you. Jamal, hello. Good morning. Hey, all. That was me. I'm not saying hi to myself. Ali, what do you think about containers at database level? Ali, I do database containers all the time. I've been doing them for years with all sorts of companies. They're fine. It's just like anything else with databases. Databases are harder than websites, right? In general, it's harder to deploy them, keep them up, keep them redundant, keep them backed up, keep them stable, keep them monitored, right? That's all harder with a database. So nothing wrong with doing them in containers. They work just fine in containers. Their performance is just fine. You back them up by running other containers and running backup scripts through those containers, or just execing into your database container. The key with databases in containers is don't make it your first project. Your first couple of projects should be easier, right? Because databases are some of the hardest things we have to do in computers. So don't make it your first project. In fact, I always advocate, if you're on a cloud, use that cloud's database hosting. Don't roll your own databases if you can get away with it. I mean, most teams don't have DB admins that are as good as the DB admins at Azure and AWS, right? So you would probably just pay the little bit of extra money so that you have full redundancy and monitoring and backups and everything on their system, and then you don't have to run your own databases and you don't have to worry about it. If you're absolutely committed to running your own, then just don't make it your first project, or practice Docker. Like, make sure you're really good at Docker before you start putting databases in it, because you need to be able to get in and out of containers and do backups and monitoring of that Docker container just like you would a real database that's not in a container, right? So I do databases all day long. They're great. Nate's up next. I'd like to know more about monitoring with Docker K8. I am working on setting up Prometheus. Is this the best solution? Do you have resources on this? So yes, Prometheus is probably the most popular cloud-native container monitoring solution that's an open source free tool. Like everything else, monitoring, logging, backups, those are sort of the staples of everything computing, especially in containers. And those things I don't like to do myself. I don't normally want to run my own logging tools, my own monitoring tools. Now, these are all really cool tools, and Prometheus is probably the easiest way to do container monitoring, but in terms of running your own thing. But I tend to if I'm a business, right, and I got money to deploy this architecture, I will tend to use something like Sysdig or Datadog or New Relic, some of these tools out there that have existed for quite some time that are focused on monitoring your containers and your hosts for you without you having to manage all this infrastructure, because you're probably already super busy. And why add more work? But if you're going to do that, Prometheus is the way to go. I would definitely do that first, and I recommend that. In fact, I've got some of that stuff coming. I don't know when. I know I'm behind schedule on the Swarm course, but if you're taking my Swarm course, that's at swarmmastery.com. There's a section that I'm going to be posting about Prometheus. If you go to dogversus.cat, I will put that in chat. HTTP dogversus.cat. That is a DockerCon video of mine that has samples for one of the best ways to get started with Prometheus, which is called Swarm Prom. And I'll actually just show you that real quick. Swarm Prom by Stefan is a really great way in containers, whether it's Kubernetes or Swarm, to get started. Now, this is specifically designed for Swarm, so you'll use this one, right, only with Swarm, and you mentioned K8. So what I would do if I was learning Prometheus, I don't have a K8's equivalent of this stuff yet, so I don't know of the best auto setup Prometheus one. Maybe there's a Helm chart for that you can look up that would help make it easier, because Prometheus has lots of parts to it. You need more than just the Prometheus container. It does contain the database inside it, but you also need alerting and alert management, and you need a GUI like Grafana. You need other things as well. So if you check out this Swarm Prom, yes, this one will run just on your local machine on Docker with Swarm enabled. So if you're only going to go Kubernetes and you only care about monitoring Kubernetes, then you're going to need a different version of this, and maybe someone can recommend this in chat. Do you have a sort of automated setup for Prometheus for Kubernetes that has all the features. So if you check out this one, it's got the dashboards all already set up in Grafana. It's sort of a one quick URL, basically you can just type Docker Swarm deploy or Docker stack deploy rather, and it would give you all this stuff out of the box on a Swarm. I don't yet have this equivalent or the knowledge of the equivalent on this one for Kubernetes. So check something out like that. And again, I give some examples on the Swarm side with my dog versus cat. I hope to be adding next year a Kubernetes equivalent on that dog versus cat video series so that we can sort of compare and contrast both. That would be pretty cool. And I would love some help with that because it's also an open source project. So I'd love some help from anyone who's willing to give some PRs on Kubernetes stuff. All right, who's next? Gustavo, should I unsubscribe to the other channel? There's great question. This is my new channel. My old one is still there. It's not going away necessarily. There's nothing new that's going to show up for it. There's no harm in staying subscribed, but it doesn't matter to me. If you want to unsubscribe from the old channel, sure. It's not going to bug you other than me posting a video later this week probably saying, hey, this channel is moved. Go over here. That's probably the last thing I'll be posting over there. But I'm going to keep the videos up because people still have links to the videos and, there's still good stuff over there. So, all right. Steven, do you have any experience with Doku container management? We are starting using it at work and wondered about its reputation. Doku has been around a very long time. They actually were one of the early players in the container hosting and orchestration game. I have not used them in years. So I don't have any... I don't have any clients using them, but there's nothing wrong with them. As far as I know, they're still around. It's still a project, open source project. So tell me what you think. I mean, if you guys are using it and you like it, let me know. If there's problems or limitations that you have with it, let me know too, because I just don't have anybody checking it out lately. I remember back when I was first using Docker and I checked it out. It was really cool tech and they were doing really neat stuff there. But I haven't heard anything about what they're doing lately. So. Good question. That is DOKKU for those of you just listening in. That is a container hosting platform as well as an open source tool, or is it? I don't know if they have the platform anymore. Maybe they're just the open source tool for hosting containers. Do you think Docker will be absorbed by Kubernetes? Chris Perkins. Interesting question. I don't know what you mean by absorbed. Do you mean the company? Because Kubernetes is not a company. It's just an open source tool, and Docker is a company with hundreds of millions of dollars of investor money in it, worth something like $2 billion or something. So I'm not sure if you mean the organizations or if you mean the tooling itself. So let's clear up some things about the difference between Docker and Kubernetes. Kubernetes is an orchestrator. Docker is a container runtime or a container engine. Now, Docker Enterprise obviously is a larger set of tools, and we can get into the different tools and how they all relate to each other. But to me, Kubernetes just makes Docker more relevant, because when you run Kubernetes out of the box, in most cases, it's just running Docker underneath. All Kubernetes really is a web API that sits on top of a container runtime, which defaults to Docker. It runs on top of that container runtime and manages it through a web API. And it basically, the job of a container orchestrator, simply, is to make many servers running containers act like one server running containers. And so since Docker already did that on a single server, Kubernetes just allowed you to do that on many servers. Now, Kubernetes has grown in complexity as well as Docker itself, because Docker itself has now have Swarm built in, which is a sort of a competitor to Kubernetes. But at this point, they do so many different things, but so many of the same things, it's even hard to compare those two tools. Docker Enterprise, the paid product that Docker really focuses on, that's how they make most of their money. Docker Enterprise, at least I think that's how they make most of their money. The Docker Enterprise tool runs Kubernetes and Swarm for you. So it's really a tool for just running whatever orchestrator you need to run. I think it supports 3 at this point. It's the old Swarm Classic, the new Swarm Mode, and then Kubernetes. And it also gives you a GUI and a registry, a image registry, along with image scanning and sort of security pipeline stuff that makes sure that everything is signed and verified all the way through your development and production pipelines. It does lots of stuff beyond just running containers or managing Kubernetes even. So it's weird to talk about what tools might take over other tools. I certainly think from a marketing and community perspective that Kubernetes has sort of become the zeitgeist of the internet and everyone's talking about it. The reality is not everybody needs Kubernetes. I mean, just because you need to run a couple of containers definitely doesn't mean you need Kubernetes. And in fact, with the projects that I work on with my clients, if you don't have a couple of dedicated engineers working DevOps and running container management, you probably shouldn't run Kubernetes. It's a lot of stuff. It's a lot of infrastructure to manage. That's why you see all of these cloud systems showing up, like ECS supports Kubernetes. Azure now has a Kubernetes platform. Even DigitalOcean now can run Kubernetes servers for you. That way you don't have to deal with the management of the infrastructure, because there's enough infrastructure there, even like Fargate, stuff like that. Those are all tools to help ease the burden of managing Kubernetes. So I think if you don't have a decent sized team of full-time DevOps people, you should either look at something like Swarm for small environments, or look at a hosted platform that manages your Kubernetes for you, because there's a database backend that you have to deal with and back up and protect, and there's failover and security and encryption and all this stuff that you have to sort of make sure is properly handled with Kubernetes, as well as upgrades. And a lot of those hosting solutions are making it way easier for us to do all that. So hopefully that gets you started and gets you down the track of whether you think what tool you might choose, Docker or Kubernetes, because really they are both the same thing. There are underpinnings of each one, Kubernetes and Docker, called Containerd, which is the sort of new sexy runtime. And it will, like Stephen Day and Phil, two friends of mine, Phil Estes, are running that project Containerd. And if you've never heard of Containerd, it's the tool that basically is going to be, I think, the de facto way to run containers. And in fact, Docker itself is shifting to this open source project as the core underlying features of how to run a container. And then Docker, the Docker command line, the Docker engine, gives you a superset of those features on top of that. And the same thing's happening with Kubernetes. Kubernetes is shifting from Docker engine runtime to Containerd runtime, unless you're on Red Hat. And Red Hat just kind of does their own thing with OpenShift and their own tooling. They tend to not go the same way as everyone else, and you kind of just stick with their platform and do whatever they tell you to do. So for the rest of us that are not on the Red Hat platform, you're probably going to end up on someday just running Containerd with something on top of it, either Docker or Kubernetes or Docker Swarm, something like that. Interesting question. All right, next up. Comp Sci Guy IT. Yeah, it's very important to click the bell. Yeah, so just because you subscribe to a channel, if you want to know about live events, you definitely need to subscribe and click that little bell. Otherwise, you won't know when I go live. I'm gonna, let's see, Gulame. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that a little bit. What's the best way to build CI/CD pipelines with Jenkins and Docker? So Jenkins has an ecosystem of plugins, right? And so you're going to look up whatever your tooling is, where you're hosting your containers. There's going to be probably tools for that in Jenkins. And the easiest way to do it with Jenkins is just to build out your pipelines and just have it SSH into your servers and then run the Docker commands like Docker pull and all that stuff. It just depends on your container orchestrator and where you're hosting your container runtimes, which tool you're going to use in Jenkins. But you can start out without a bunch of fancy add-ons and just create your pipelines to shell an SSH into your servers and do the commands on each server. Once you get into orchestration, then you probably want to look at other tools that will manage that. There's Swarm plugins. I'm sure there's Kubernetes plugins for Jenkins that help make it easier to sit on your Jenkins server and deploy apps. The thing about an orchestrator is that it will solve the update problem. So as you, well, maybe not all of the problem, but it certainly makes it way easier for you to do updates. And Jenkins, then you'll make just decisions in Jenkins around what commands you want to run, whether they're Swarm commands or kube control commands to deploy your apps and update your apps. So I don't have a specific tool that will magically make it all easier. Hopefully that helps. Wimpy. Or is it Wimpy? Sorry about mispronouncing your name. How would you implement Docker Compose to have different mappings or environments set up for different operating systems. This largely goes, okay, so Docker Compose, I talk about a lot. So there's actually, let me see if I can find this article real quick. There's an article I read, but I wrote it before I read it. I wrote an article, let's see if I can find that, on O'Reilly last month. I can never find it. All right, I'll put this in chat. This article talks about Docker Compose and specifically on the features in Docker Compose for teams dealing with multiple environments, multiple OSs, and a lot of the teams that I help nowadays, they're using both Mac and Windows and sometimes even some Linux people. So it's normal. You can get everything to work usually. I haven't had a team that's gave up on Compose, but it is definitely, Docker Compose is definitely the tool to be using in your teams for local container management, container runtime. I mean, if you're running Docker commands locally, then you should look at Docker Compose because most often it's going to be way easier to do that than it is a bunch of manual Docker commands or shell scripts. So check that out. There's actually 3 major areas I talk about in here. Using environment variables, you can use that at least 3 different ways in Compose to allow it to be very, very flexible with your team. Look at something called override files. Override files are the magic sauce for 2 people using the same Compose file, because any file called dockercompose.override.yaml, you can have that on your local machine. Don't store that in Git. You know, put that in your Git ignore so that it's not stored in Git, and then you can have a custom override that changes the environment settings or any custom settings like ports that you want for your Compose versus your friends across the cubicle farm that is running on a different machine and wants different ports and different environment settings. So you can both have the same Docker Compose file but have different override files that are not committed into Git. And that's a really cool thing. The next thing here is templating. So templating is a relatively new thing that allows you to put this little part, if you can see here, this little part at the top of your Docker files, your Compose files. And that is YAML templating that allows you to reuse sections in your YAML so you don't have to repeat yourself. And then the third one is controlling your scope. And so there's this thing in Compose called projects. That's how everything gets named. It's usually your default set to the directory you're in, and you want to control that so that maybe you want to start up the same app twice in 2 different Compose environments. You can do that. Or you can run 2 or 3 different apps in different directories. You can do all that. So check out that document. I hope that helps you because, yes, definitely Compose with Teams is pretty sweet, but there's a lot of hidden features in it that aren't obvious on your first couple of weeks using it. All right, next question. Josh, what are your thoughts on Pivotal Cloud Foundry? Cloud Foundry is very cool tech. I don't use it anymore since I'm using containers all the time. Cloud Foundry for me just is not something that I deal with. I'm usually focused on containers, Compose, Kubernetes, Swarm. I went to LinuxConf last year in 2017. Actually, it's where I got this jacket. I spoke there on Docker and Swarm, and they had a lot of sessions on Cloud Foundry. A lot of people were still in there talking. So it's not, I wouldn't say that it's old tech. It's just different tech. And I don't necessarily use it nowadays. So I'm probably not the best person to give you an accurate depiction on that, on current stuff. Myrnal, sorry if I mispronounced your name. Best practices for troubleshooting Kubernetes and Docker, what to look and where to look. Wow, we could have a whole podcast on that. It's a great question. So the first thing you need to learn is distributed computing troubleshooting. And I actually do that a little bit in my live courses where I teach you just basic network troubleshooting, because a lot of orchestration troubleshooting is figuring out how your app works across many servers. And so you need to be very good and comfortable with jumping into containers with execs. How do you get to different nodes and get into those containers depending on whether you're using Swarm or Kubernetes? There's that. On top of that, you need to understand the fundamentals of your orchestrator and how it works. So you've got to, before you can learn how to troubleshoot it, because a lot of times really troubleshooting is really just looking at logs and interpreting what's happening in real time. And in order to do that, you have to really understand how the system you're using works, right? So Kubernetes obviously has way more moving parts in it than Swarm. With Swarm, there's something that people don't know usually on day one called Docker events. And you can type the Docker events command. If you're just using Docker or Docker Compose or Swarm, the Docker events command will give you a live stream of what's happening on nodes, whether that's the Docker engine or the Swarm itself. So it's sort of dumping out every single decision and action it's taking. Other than, obviously, you got daemon logs, you've got the container logs for each container. If you're using Kubernetes or Swarm and you're using Docker underneath that, then you would maybe enable the daemon debug. So you would run Docker D with a -- debug, I believe it is. And so if you had a problem system or a problem app that you needed to troubleshoot, you might turn on the debugging if you think it's something related to containers or the container engine. I think a lot of people, when it comes to nodes in your orchestrator, a lot of people start to troubleshoot when they really should just throw the node away. If you've got a properly designed orchestrator, your worker nodes ideally should be disposable. And your storage, your permanent storage, should be off the server disk. It should be somewhere else on EBS or EFS or S3 or whatever, some block storage, right? So that means the node itself is ephemeral, and you can just throw it. So if I have funky servers, which it happens to me on AWS, I'll have a funky server that's just not acting right. And instead of trying to troubleshoot it, if it's in production, I really care more about the health of the app and getting it back up than I do like, troubleshooting and figuring out exactly what was the problem there. I really care more about uptime at that point. So usually in production, I will just kill that node and have the orchestrator reschedule those containers on a different node. Hopefully, if you're in production, all of your container services or your deployments are highly available. So there's no single container, even if it's a database container, you've got database mirroring at the database level or replication. If you're at the app level, you've got some sort of app redundancy, because that's what's going to save you in times of troubleshooting. In terms of tooling, one of the best tools is NetShoot. So check out NetShoot. If you just search for that, you'll probably find this GitHub repo. I'll put this in chat. NetShoot is a growing collection of Linux tools, mostly just regular old Linux tools, that are all in a single container image that will help you if you need to troubleshoot an app or a node or a network or something like that. You can basically jump into a shell in this container and have all the tools you need to troubleshoot. These are mostly just regular Linux networking tools and system tools. So they're nothing necessarily unique to them. There's a couple of things, but they're mostly you just learning, things like DNS and DIG and Netcat and all sorts of other tools that have been around for probably decades, and learning how to use them and practicing using them inside of containers and getting used to them. So, this insane little chart here shows you, if you really were focusing on Linux, the entire stack of technologies and different tools that inspect different parts of the stack. Now, I in no way know all these tools or even half of these tools well, but I've been doing this stuff forever, it feels like, and I've been able to get away with, just knowing a little bit about most of them and having a general idea. And then if I ever need to use them in real time, I usually have to search command parameters and Google exactly how to get a tool to do. The most important thing with all this stuff is to know what tool to use for what. And if you think you've got slow performance, but the app is running, it's just slow, and you use a simple little command to figure out the I/O and maybe see if the disk I/O is performant, those are all these kind of tools that you would have in here. Or maybe you need to focus on CPU performance and you need to understand basic tools on how to check if the CPUs are being used too much, and you basically have CPU throttling happening, especially if you're on AWS and you're using cheap instances, they tend to throttle. So look at that stuff. That will probably get you 9 out of 10 ways into the debugging and troubleshooting of Swarm, because Swarm and Kubernetes are really themselves just network-based tools. So if you need to troubleshoot them, you're using these tools usually, not necessarily specialized tools. I hope that helps. There's probably worth making an entire course on troubleshooting containers and distributed computing, and I look forward to your thoughts on that. Maybe that's a course for late next year after we get through all the Kubernetes and other stuff. All right, what's next? let's see, where were we? Sadakar, I'm hopefully pronouncing that slightly correct. What is your opinion on Dockerizing the .NET product? How do we install Windows-based EXEs in Docker containers? So easy. You use Docker images just like everything else. So you'd make Docker files, and you would use PowerShell commands in them. And you can actually, I will send you some slides. Let's see, velocity. Let me get some of my old slides. I have some Windows slides on, nope, it's not in there. It's in here. Let me go back over here. On good links for you to read about this stuff. So there's several, there's at least 3 good people that are blogging a lot about Windows containers, and 2 of them actually work for Docker. See if I can find these real quick. Windows containers. So I'll put this link in chat. In here, there's some basics about Windows containers, but also links. And it's basically my take on where you should go and learn about how to build them, how to run them, where to find them. Let me see if I can find that page here. So for example, I typically learn how Docker files for different apps are built by going and looking at the Docker files of those apps. So in this case, you can go look at the official Microsoft and the Hub official containers. And in there, for example, if I wanted to see how they built Redis on Windows, then somewhere in here is hopefully, oh, there's no Docker file here. Meh. So it's probably somewhere in GitHub in the Docker library for this one. I picked a bad example. But the Windows Docker files, well, let's just look at a different one. For example, .NET, right? .NET is, when you see the .NET here, by the way, that's the .NET Core. When you see .NET Framework, that is the traditional .NET for whatever. So if we went and scrolled down, we could find not that one. See, oh, there we go. I think I saw it. .NET Framework. So the .NET Framework here, oh man, they don't have links to their Docker files either. So I know I've looked at these. Oh, here we go, down here, right, because they're depending on each version of Windows, because they're all different. So the brand new Windows Server 2019, if you wanted to check out their Docker file, this is how I used to learn at the very beginning of my sort of Docker career. Of course, that's a bad example because it's just one little line. I would go through a lot of these Docker files and see how they built them. And if it's Windows, it's going to be either Windows command, like a CMD command, but usually it's PowerShell commands. And then you're just copying in EXEs, or you're using .NET to build them inside the container by using the framework image like this. So hopefully that gets you started, and that link gets you the slides and information you need to jump onto that. But yeah, .NET's a thing now. How can I deploy the services? Steven's back. How do I deploy? I think they're back. Either we have 2 Stevens. How can I deploy all the services in my Docker Compose using Docker Stack Deploy? Exactly that way. Docker Stack Deploy -C, and then the Compose file name, and then you name your stack, and there you go. It'll launch. You might have some changes that are different for your Docker Compose file in development versus production in Swarm, but the files will work with each other. They're completely compatible across the board, as long as it's version 3. So just change the version in the top line to version 3, and you're usually good to go. Let's see. Mernal, best practices for taking backups in the K8s environment. Any free tools would help to do it. I don't have any tools on that. Mostly what I do is I run jobs, so Kubernetes jobs, and I run the commands. Like if you're doing, let's say, a Mongo database, I would do a Mongo dump through a jobs command and just point that to the storage I need to put it. I don't know of specialized backup tools that run containers. I'm sure there are some, but those would probably be for each vendor's product, right? I mean, backups don't really change in containers, in my opinion. Like if you need to back up volumes, they should be stored on off disk. And if you need to back up stuff in a container, then like doing a database export to a sort of a backup compatible file, then you just run that as more containers. And you can either choose to connect over the network or run it as an EXEC and exec into that container and run it directly on that container. Either way is your choice. But no, sorry, I don't have specialized container tools for backups. You're welcome, Charles. All right, Pascal. Hey, what's up? We know each other. We all know that CI/CD is the way to go. I'm reading Running Containers in Production for Dummies by Sysdig, and they now talk about CI/CD CS. Yeah. So I just actually sent out a newsletter. I don't know if that's related to the Sysdig thing, but I just sent out a newsletter this morning on the Sysdig book. So if you're on my newsletter, you would have gotten an email this morning with a link to a free download of the Dummies book, a Dummies edition of Sysdig's containers, container production. So let me see if I can find that. Sysdig. Yep. So I will put this link in the chat, and you can all get a free book because Sysdig created one, and it's Sysdig Containers for Dummies, Containers in Production for Dummies. So I know that you all are super smart on containers, so maybe get the book and give it to your friends that are Docker noobs. But that's a book. I haven't read it yet, so let me know if it's good. I actually have it on my Kindle, but I haven't started reading it yet. All right. Next up, we got a few more questions before the hour's up, but if you don't get a chance to stay around and listen to them, notice that this recording will stay here. You can watch it later. Also, if I miss on your questions because we ran out of time, I always hang out in chat, in the text chat, and I will answer all questions in the text chat, even though we might end the video before all the questions are answered, because I try to end the video at about an hour or so. So let's see if we can get a few more questions here. Anuj, sorry if I mispronounced your name there. Do I need at least 2 servers to set up Kubernetes for deployment, one for master and the other for node, or is this can be done on single server? So with Swarm and Kubernetes, you can technically do everything on a single server. You may not want to. I certainly wouldn't go production. The thing about Kubernetes, the funny thing is, if you're going to go production with a single node of Kubernetes, I would say, why do you need Kubernetes? Because you probably could just use Swarm and be way easier, and you wouldn't have so many things. Because Kubernetes uses a lot of resources out of the box. You would need at least a few gig of RAM, some CPUs just for all the stuff that Kubernetes is going to run. And the way to find this out is if you're running Docker for Windows or Docker for Mac, you can actually go in and into the settings and the preferences and enable Kubernetes, and it will create a little mini Kubernetes server on your local Docker install for you. And then you can go in there. If you tell it to not hide all the containers, you can see like there's 15 or so containers running. It's using a bunch of RAM. And Docker's done a great job, as well as the Kubernetes team, at continuing to shrink the RAM usage and storage, but it's still a lot, way more than Swarm and Docker itself. So if you're using a single server, and just for learning, that's fine. Yeah, you can totally do it on a single server. But in production, if I'm only going to have one server, I've always, up until now, gone for Swarm because it works really well as a single server setup. Anyway, yes, it does work. Let's see. Do I need this? How do Said Hakar? Hopefully I'm pronouncing that close to how it sounds. How the licensing of product works in containers world. That's totally dependent on the product, man. If depending on products, they may license per running instance. And whether you're running something in a container or you're running it on a host, you're still running the application, right? So if you're running your application 5 times and it's on 5 different servers, it might be licensed different than if it's running 5 times on the same server. I don't know how different apps license themselves, so that would be very, very specific to the app. And I just don't know. Sorry. For instance, I think nowadays, like Oracle, maybe SQL Server nowadays, they all license per CPU. So depending on how you're licensing them, but they tend to be licensed per CPU, or core now. So that's sort of dependent upon how many cores you have, not how much, whether you're running them in containers or not. So Do you see an advantage of using KAs over Swarm? So yes, Ron, great question. Swarm versus Kubernetes, they both have their advantages and disadvantages. There's way too many to go for in this chat because it honestly is almost one of those consulting answers where it depends. It depends on the size of your team, your expertise, how many apps you're going to run, how many servers can you buy, what's your infrastructure look like? What are you doing multi-cloud? Are you focused on a specific vendor or a specific cloud? All those questions sort of relate into what your orchestrator is going to be. I tend to tell people that without knowing anything about their project or anything about their expertise, their environment, if you're just now getting started with Docker, Swarm's built in. So just try that. My Swarm course you can watch my entire Swarm course in a day or two, and you can learn all the basics and fundamentals of Swarm very quickly. I could teach you Swarm in half a day if you already know Docker, and you'll learn all the things about how to run a Swarm, really. Not maybe all the things, but you'll learn all the major commands and all the major operations. Kubernetes has way more functionality, way more nuance, and a lot more to it. So, for instance, there's really one or two ways to deploy applications in Swarm. And I think like the Kubernetes ecosystem has over 60 projects now on how to deploy different ways to deploy apps to Kubernetes. So there's a lot more to Kubernetes. It, I think, is definitely the more popular choice. And it makes sense if you've got a larger team and growing amount of infrastructure and maybe even if you're in a cloud and you want to take advantage of the cloud's Kubernetes systems where they build and manage Kubernetes for you, then yeah, there's an advantage there because no one's built a Swarm management engine in AWS. There are third-party companies that do that, but AWS and Azure don't have Swarm equivalents because Swarm is so easy to use, quite frankly. Like, it's a one-line install. So it doesn't require a lot of setup and work to manage it. It's secure out of the box by default. So I tend to tell people, hey, on day one, just try Swarm. If it works for you, if it solves your problems, then stick with that because it's way less work and way less maintenance than Kubernetes. If you get into it and you realize that you need Kubernetes because of some specific feature that you don't have maybe in Swarm, then go Kubernetes. And a lot of your knowledge will translate from Swarm into Kubernetes. So you're not lost. Plus, I think eventually, if we're all into DevOps, eventually we're all going to have to know both anyway. I see companies that use both sometimes where they're using Swarm for small projects. Swarm is much more developer friendly. Kubernetes was designed for operators in mind. Kubernetes is very focused on operations and from the operator's mindset. So it's not necessarily the most developer-friendly solution out there, right? So I think Swarm tends to work better in the workflow of a small team because if they're already using Docker Compose files, those just work in Swarm. They can sort of continue their workflow, and it all just works with the team. So there's so much we could talk about there, but in general, I'd say learn both. Start with Swarm. It's nice and easy. You can learn that pretty quick, and then check out Kubernetes and get a sense for which one you think you can handle in terms of overhead and management, and which one you think your team's really going to need in terms of the size and flexibility of your infrastructure. At the end of the day, they're both kind of doing 80% of the same thing, and Swarm is getting more performant and adding more features, and Kubernetes is getting easier to use. So they're both kind of like merging into the same sort of things. But I think definitely Kubernetes has won the internet zeitgeist of the popularity contest. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's always the right choice, right? All right, a few more questions. Dan, I have a Docker Compose file that generates two containers, a MySQL container and a Node.js container for code. npm install runs in the build, however, volume mount, the folder is empty and app crashes. What's the best way to handle node modules, npm dependencies with Docker Compose? So Dan, have you seen, maybe you've seen my Node.js project example. I have something called Node.js or Node Good Defaults. In fact, I got a whole course coming out on it soon, and you can check that out. That will hopefully guide you on Docker Compose and stuff like that. For your specific issue, though, two containers, a MySQL container and a Node.js container. npm install runs in the build. However, volume mount, the folder is empty and app crashes. So if you're definitely follow the guidelines in my GitHub repo there. That will work. I'm not sure what the difference is between your compose file and your Docker file than mine, then because definitely, obviously, it shouldn't crash and all that. So node modules, just like with Composer for PHP or other dependency systems, ideally for local development, I always design it so that those dependencies are outside of the directory of my app. So that means you're building it in the image and you're usually moving it to some other directory. So your node modules would be one level up from your app directory. And you'll see that in my example repo there. That's how I do it. That way you don't end up bind mounting your host node modules into a container. Because if you're on Mac or Windows, that host is going to have different binaries in those node modules, because some of them are actual binaries that are built for the host OS. When you mount those in, they're not going to run on Linux. So you've got to make sure that that all works. And my repo talks about that, so you should check that out. And that will be a part of my new course, I don't have a title yet. Docker for Node.js, Docker Mastery for Node.js, something like that. When that comes out, it'll answer all those questions and give you more details if you can't find the answers in my repo there. All right, great question. Marunal's back. How do I troubleshoot the containers which are exited, and reason to why it did exit? How does that work in K8s? So how do I troubleshoot the containers which are exited and the reason to why it did it exit? So logging. You should need to be capturing all of your logs, both out of Kubernetes and out of your applications, and shipping them off to a logging engine. And they should be able to diagnose the reason for exit. Usually a container exits not because of the orchestrator, but usually because the container itself has a problem, meaning your app had a problem. And that's usually going to present an error code and usually some sort of exit problem with your app. So that's going to show up in two places. One, in the container logs for your app. So if your app actually crashed, it usually does some sort of dump on the screen, and that's captured into the logs. And then the Docker engine will capture the logs, and you'll need to make sure that, not capture the logs, sorry. It will capture the exit code if you're interested in that, and you need to make sure that those logs are all shipped off. So it depends on where you're at, right? If you're using ELK, because that's an open source log tool, or my favorite, Papertrail, you just need to make sure all those logs are there from all the things. I hope that helps get you closer to your solution. Is that piano? No, that's Plano. Plano full. In Linux, can I tie a PID back to a Docker container? Okay, yes and no. So all applications have PIDs in Linux. That's a great, interesting question. Everything has a PID, right? So if it's a process, but a container isn't exactly a process. So it's not like a virtual machine is running or anything. So you're going to have something called containerd. So you're going to have Docker, and then you're going to have something called containerd, and then you're going to have something called runc. And these are all things that are wrapping the executable that's running in your container. But really, from your host level, your applications have a PID, and those are running in the containers. Like, they're just regular applications running on the host OS. They just happen to be compartmentalized from a security perspective and a resource perspective. That's why we call them contained. That doesn't mean that they're encapsulated or hidden away. You can actually just do a PS command on the host, and you'll see every one of your container apps running natively on the host, because that's what they're doing. They're just restricted. So you would see the PID of that application, like MySQL, and you would focus on that from the host level. When you are inside the container, from the container's point of view, it's the application that it launched, it always PID 0. So if you launched MySQL, it would be in the container, it would be PID 0. From the host, it would have a high number PID because it was launched by Docker, essentially. So I hope that helps. Great question. All right, we're going to do two more, and then I want to end the video, but still answer any questions for you in the chat. So let's see, who's the lucky last two people? I lost my place. Can I use Jenkins as a container on the Docker host? Yes. Jenkins has an official image. You can run it as a container. It's super easy to use. It's the way I deploy Jenkins now whenever I use it. That's on Docker Hub. Let's see. Hey, Brett, is there an open source tool used to easily manage Docker Swarm mode, perhaps some kind of web API? Yes. If someone else hasn't said it already, look up Portainer for Swarm API. Portainer is the best one if you're going for free. if you want a paid one, Docker Enterprise is the best paid tool. But Portainer.io is the best free tool, and it manages Docker, not just Swarm, but you can use it on any Docker server. Let's see if we can get two more there. Guillaume, thank you. Didn't want to mess that one up. Let's see. Part 1. About Docker Compose, I have a project that will go soon to production on VM with Docker Compose, Docker CE, Docker Suite Wealth. So the question, Guillaume, is if you are using Docker Compose or Swarm. I always recommend Swarm if you can do it. If your app will support it. There's some apps, like if you're using graphical stuff, you need to use the GPU. Then Swarm won't do that yet, like device support. But I always recommend a single node Swarm. If you are new to my stuff here, I have something called AMA on GitHub, and it's basically a list of questions. And in there is a question about this very topic, about whether to use Compose or Swarm. And I always recommend using Swarm even on a single node, because you get a lot of more features out of the box, and it does things like auto recreate the containers when they crash. It monitors them with health checks. It has encrypted database for secret storage. It does all these things that you can't get with Docker Compose. So for that reason alone, I always recommend a single node Swarm. And the last question is, could you Docker for noobs? Yes, I do, and that's called Docker Mastery. That's my very first course that I put out over a year ago, actually. So check out dockercompose.com or go to my webpage at brettfisher.com/docker. And that very first course there is designed as a Docker 101 and takes you all the way through the basics of using Compose and the basics of even using Swarm, all in a 10-hour course. So check that out. It's what I recommend to anyone new to Docker. So, and Biker's back. I see all your questions, but I will get to those in chat. I thank you so much for subscribing to this new channel. So hopefully we're gonna, make this channel even better in the next year. I've got lots of plans for having stuff on this channel, and I'm better at YouTube all the time. So thanks for sticking with me. Again, sign up for my newsletter, brettfisher.com/newsletter, and I will answer the rest of your questions in chat after we end this video. So hang around if your question wasn't answered yet, and I will get to them in chat. Thanks again, and I'll see you next week at DockerCon EU.